You are tuning in to the Pop Culture Retrospective Podcast.
This show is dedicated to the memory of my big sister Rebecca, a fan of all things pop culture, particularly of the people, places, and things that defined the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Welcome aboard this pop culture time machine. I'm Amy Lewis. This is episode number 96, a look at Fans and Fandom with writer, journalist, and fandom expert Holly Swinyard. In this episode, I was able to interview this fascinating author who had so much to share about fandom from hundreds of years ago to present day. From Shakespeare to Lord of the Rings, being an impassioned fan of something is a much deeper concept and conversation than you may think. As always, this was a fun and informative conversation. And note, there are a few brief moments where our video call/audio cut out, but it may not even be that noticeable. Fingers crossed. So sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Holly Swinyard. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you so very much for tuning into the Pop Culture Retrospective Podcast. I am always Amy Lewis, your faithful host. And today I am so grateful. I am joined by the one and only Holly Swinyard. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
First time is quite impressive, I have to say. Most people do not get it straight off.
Okay. Well, because I've lived, as I like to blame where I grew up. So I've lived in two different regions of the United States that have much different accents. So I tend to butcher people's last names and often first names and different locations. So I'm glad to hear that. So Holly is a pop culture writer with a love for all things fandom. They have worked on everything from tabletop role-playing games to costume and fashion journalism, from Marvel Comics to Play Magazine, from cosplay to video games. And as one half of the Fandom Podcast, I'm a fan of that. It's not hard to see that they have made a study of geekdom inside and out, which we're going to be talking about momentarily, which I'm very excited about. In this new book, they take a deep dive into what it is about pop culture and being a fan that draws people in and drives a passion to share, debate, and create around their favorite characters and stories. There is more to fan culture than meets the eye, which I definitely learned. And there is much more to the fans themselves and what they are capable of than what people might think. Holly has been working in and around pop culture industries since they were a teenager, and this book is a mix of the history of fan culture, interviews with academics, industry professionals, and fans themselves, and personal essays on the way that fandom and the passion for storytelling has changed the course of not only Holly's own life, but also those of the people around them. There is so much more to being a fan than buying merch and queuing for the new Star Wars movie. This is true. And so much more to pop culture than men in tights and capes. Amen to that as well.
Absolutely.
So Holly, thank you so much for coming to the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I forgot I wrote that. That was quite good.
That was very helpful. And I think as I'm not a sort of fandom or geekdom expert by any means, but after having read your book, that seems like a very good way to describe what we're going to be talking about today. So
thank you so much for having me on. I'm very excited. I'm going to be honest, talking about fandom, pop culture. It's one of my favorite things to do. As I said, I've already got my own podcast, which I spend way too many hours talking about it. So now I get to do it on someone else's.
Yes, it's not nice when when you're on the other side of the table. It's kind of nice. Yeah. I hear you on that for sure. So. I guess let's just kind of start at the beginning, because there's these really, really sweet parts of your book that kind of allude to sort of how this all came about. But can you tell us a little bit about when you knew that fandom and fan culture and writing were going to play an important part of your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that, like, it's very hard to pinpoint that first moment, but I absolutely can pinpoint the first time that I knew that these sorts of stories were super important to me. Mm-hmm. And I remember, and I don't know if it's one of the stories I put in the book, but it's definitely one of the things that I allude to, is sitting with my dad, like literally with our backs against the radiator in my bedroom. And I must have been like maybe 4 or 5. And he was reading me The Hobbit. And just the way that this story, I can still remember the opening lines as if it was like yesterday. Of course, I've read it 100 times, but since then, that moment of sitting there and going, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit,
Mm-hmm.
not a dirty wet hole with the ends of worms. All of that, like I literally, it's in my brain forever, that opening section.
Yeah.
And just sitting there with him and him sharing the story with me, which he loved as a kid as well. Like it was one of his favorite books, and him sharing it with me. And then that spiraling into probably one of my first major passions as a young child. Okay, so there's the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings were like, I would probably say, my first major fandom, alongside books like the Redwall series, which I think I mentioned being the first thing I joined a fan club for, by Brian Jacks. I don't know how much they did in the States, but they were very popular in the late 90s and early 2000s in the UK. But also Sherlock Holmes. And these were all things that were introduced to me by my family in one way or another, particularly by my dad, who would sit and read stories with me as a kid. And I have these very vivid memories of sharing these stories with him. And my mum, of course, but like I don't know what it was. Maybe it was his choices of books that really like piqued something.
Wow.
And as a little kid with some fun neurodivergencies that I didn't know about, these were things that I could really get into, and I could share them with people. I could share them with him. I could share them with my best friend at the time, who absolutely adored the Rebel books, was the person who introduced me to those. And it was just like, oh, when you share these stories with other people, that's what makes them brilliant. They're brilliant anyway. They're great, and you connect to them. But when you get that mutual connection and that moment of like, oh, you love this thing and I love this thing and we can love it together. And we can share that. That's super exciting. And particularly with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, like my dad recorded all of the Lord of the Rings Radio 4 dramatization off the radio onto tape cassettes for me, which probably says how old I am. But like he did it because I wasn't able to do it because it was on at a time of day. I think it must have been when I was at school or something. So he was making sure that it got like that kind of thing. Yeah. Where it's like, as much as maybe it wasn't his big thing, he knew that I loved it, and he knew that that was something we could do together. Yeah. And I relate it in the book particularly to sports. That thing of a lot of people talking about going to see sport with their dad or a parent or a brother or a sister or something like that. And how maybe it's not actually the thing they're super interested in, but they still go every Saturday to see the game because it's the thing they do together. And it's the thing they do with their friends. And to me, that is a form of fandom. Obviously, it's a form of fandom. And I just feel like these things are so like that your familial connections, your relationships bond you into these things. So that was kind of where I started this book, was like, I really want to talk about that. And I don't want to talk about it in relation to sport because so many people have written that book. I think I have a list in the front that's like, if you want to do this with sport, here's the books you should go and read, because somebody else wrote those and I don't need to write it again. Because I felt like, and also because that's not my story, right? That's not where I come from. So that's somebody else's story, and somebody else can tell it super passionately. I actually really loved watching the Wrexham documentary on Disney Plus for that exact reason. That I was like, oh, I'm getting to see the same story that I have with pop culture play out with people with football. That's awesome. That's so cool. And these same moments of like understanding. I was like, I get this. I don't get football, but I get this, know, this feeling. So that was very much where I started this book, was wanting to talk about people and how people work and why we love telling stories to each other and what it is that is a thread of connection through them. It's I think I used the quote from Ursula Le Guin in the end of the book. It's not a spoiler, I promise. And I can't remember exactly, but it's something like, we are all alone reaching out into the darkness, hoping for someone to reach back. And I was like, of course, Ursula Le Guin totally gets it. It's about human connection, and stories are human connection. That's what it is. And it's not just reading about superheroes because it's fun. It is fun, definitely.
Isn't it amazing how you can sort of have these photographic memories of your whether it's your family or your parents, but you mentioning sitting with your dad and you can remember where in the room you were sitting. I mean, that's pretty profound. And I think that that's a really good point that you brought up throughout the book, whether it is sports or some aspect of literature or action figures or whatever, that there is this connection and this joint love of something that really can bring people together. And I liked the point that you made too about how it's kind of like more socially acceptable, especially for like men to bond over like sports, but in many ways, other things that we're fans of, it's the same thing, is people being in a contest against each other. I think you mentioned, there's like a villain, there's a protagonist, like it's all the same, whether it's, a game of football or it's Star Wars, there's a lot of similar qualities. There's just one,
sports is so much drama. There's something actually I don't necessarily talk about in the book. I wanted to, but it was kind of like, how many words can I give to any given topic? But I have talked about it on my own podcast, is the idea that sports has the same level of drama in it as any soap opera. You go up and down, the scores, the people that are coming and going. Someone becomes the villain of the week, the manager, all this kind of stuff. People have these interpersonal relationships in the same sort of way. Yes. It's almost like reality TV kind of, or some sort of reality interactive kind of thing, particularly now that we have Twitter, Instagram, social media in general. And I kind of feel like it's really funny when you talk to people about it and you go, oh, I see, I can almost place these character stereotypes onto what you're talking about, because humans relate everything through stories, everything through storytelling. It doesn't matter if it's reality or whether it's fiction, or whether it's non-fiction historical stuff. The story is what gets people. It's very much the same thing, and it's great to kind of explore that in some way. That
well, that's what she managed to do. And when I was thinking about, you told me that you'd written this book, I thought, well, that sounds really interesting, and I wonder where this will go, and who the layers of what you're able to dive into is really intriguing. That the things that I didn't even think about, fandoms that I had no awareness of. It's pretty amazing. So can you tell us a little bit about your book that I believe is coming out this summer?
Yes, it should be out at the beginning of May, end of April, depending on where you are in the world. So in the UK, it should be in a couple of weeks, which is terrifying. But it's pre-order pretty much everywhere at the moment, which is great. So if you look for A History of Fans and Fandom, if you are interested in it, you can find it. So that's good. But it is essentially, as we said at the top of the show in the intro, an exploration of fan culture, and what that looks like for various different people, what that looks like throughout history. Like, I start with talking about the letter writing campaign to Conan Doyle, and how essentially his fans bullied him into bringing Sherlock Holmes back, which...
Who knew? I didn't know that at all.
It's definitely, there's more to it, but it's more of a fun story to tell. You just go, they made it happen. And the Sherlock Holmes fandom, the Holmesians, they still exist, the Holmes fan club and stuff that was set up then. It does exist in one form or another. There are magazines and stuff that you can trace back all the way through these things. There is sort of a history to this fandom from those first fans, which is amazing. And I just love the story of them going out onto the streets after the final problem came out, and they're wearing black armbands, and they're mourning for a fictional character in real life. And there were protests, there were funerals held for him. Like, the way that we see, I relate it to things like the Torchwood Memorial in Cardiff, where there's a massive memorial to a Doctor Who character in Cardiff Bay, and it's still there. Like 20 years later, it's not quite that much, but it's a long time later. And these, people, you go back even further than that. You have manias around actresses and music hall, and even like Byron and stuff like this. People want to sit and discuss these conversations, and they want to be fans of people. There's an amazing book by a historian, Greg Jenner, which is all about the history of celebrity, which was a huge help to this, because obviously celebrity and fan culture cross over quite a lot. And I absolutely recommend checking that out if you have an interest in celebrity fandoms, because wow. But even I think I talk about I definitely talk about the Shakespeare convention.
That was
1796.
Amazing.
And in the 1700s, people held an event that was essentially a convention. They dressed up in costumes. There were vendors. There were panels and talks, and like a ball, all this sort of stuff. There was events. There's a program for it. You can still see, and people bought merchandise. It's a convention, right? And it's held in the 1700s for Shakespeare, in a period where Shakespeare's gone really out of fashion. So these are die-hard fans wanting to bring it back. It was set up by the actor Garrick, who was, you know, very influential at the time, but absolutely adored Shakespeare and really wanted it to be him, the Shakespeare's plays to be brought back, but also by the Ladies Shakespeare Club, which was literally a group of women, not dissimilar to a book club, sort of upper class women who went around sort of proselytizing about Shakespeare in a time when he was deeply unfashionable. And they raised money and put on this event and put a statue up to him in Stratford and the whole thing. And it was like 3 days.
Yeah.
And it was a convention. And I'm absolutely sure, considering that this was an idea that they had, this wasn't the first one. It's probably the one we have the most record of.
Yeah.
It's the one I could find the most about.
Sure.
But I'm certain that there would have been other events similar to this.
Yeah, there must have been.
Must have been.
Yeah.
But it maybe not about Shakespeare, maybe about something else. But
Right.
I find it fascinating that I, as a convention goer, as somebody who's been going to cons since I was 15,
Wow.
could absolutely recognize this as the same thing that I do in the accent in London or, you know, in New York or something like that. They are so similar. And I thought that was, even to the point that what I found quite funny is that they do panels and stuff, but they don't actually put on a play. It's just discussing Shakespeare. It's not actually doing Shakespeare, but we will dress up as Shakespeare characters, but not to do a play. And I'm like, oh, that's cosplayers for you. You know? And I thought that was very, very funny. And again, part of that event to this day still happens. People are still doing the walk that they did through the town on the day of Shakespeare's birth as part of the Shakespeare Festival. That still happens. There is a connection point from those people in the 1700s to the present day. And fandom has this through line that you can see where things get picked up and something that people go, oh, we like that bit, we'll keep that bit. And we like this bit, we'll keep that bit. So, you know, the Conan Doyle fans were writing letters to each other, writing magazines. You know, they had commonplace books, which are essentially little journals that there's a wonderful academic article comparing commonplace books, which essentially are scrapbooks for putting photographs and pieces of information. Sherlock Holmes is actually described as having one, so it's sort of a journaling kind of thing, but you collect things you're interested in, like newspapers and stuff. But this article compares it to Tumblr, and I'm like, it is Tumblr. It's Tumblr.
Yeah,
you know? It doesn't necessarily have to be stuff you make. It's stuff you're interested in and you collect into one place. Right. And I really like that concept. Yeah. But they kind of have that, and that kind of continues. And I mean, it's a very Victorian thing, as the commonplace book, but it's something that kind of continues. And then it's arguable that kind of turns into zines. You know, these collected ideas of it, sharing it, talking about each other, into your blogs, into your newsletters, all this sort of stuff. You see these shared collected ideas continuing to go along. And that's just something I loved, finding these stories. And looking at these things. And some of them were things that I had an idea about. Like, I had an idea about the Shakespeare Festival because it was mentioned in Greg Jenner's book. And I was like, that's really interesting. I want to go and learn more about that. Yeah. I knew about the Sherlock Holmes thing because I'm a Sherlock Holmes fan myself. And so I had an idea that this had happened, but I didn't know how apocryphal it was and how true this actually was. And I went down such a rabbit hole there.
Not the best.
And it was like, okay, this is pretty true, and I can tell a story about this. I will hold my hands up to the fact that I am a journalist, and so some of these things I have made a little fun, sensational, to make the story a little bit more fun to read. But the historical truth is there. It is there, but you know, it's more fun if you make it a fun story. Right. And
it makes complete sense. Yeah, it makes complete sense. That sorry. I was going to say, I mean, how kind of one thing has unfolded and evolved into something else. It just kind of takes 1, 2, or maybe more dedicated fans to sort of initiate something, and like a whole movement that could eventually span generation after generation kind of continues. It's pretty amazing. And I had no idea that, you know, Shakespeare stuff existed. And like you pointed out, I mean, maybe he wouldn't be as popular in literature and schools across the world if it, you know, weren't for, you know, these fans wanting to kind of continue to tell his story.
I absolutely think that these moments, particularly with the Shakespeare Festival and the stuff with Sherlock Holmes, which was why I felt I wanted to really include those as opposed to some other ones that I found out about, was because they felt to me like they really changed the course of history. when it came to the Sherlock Holmes stuff. We would not have the majority of the canon we have for Sherlock Holmes if those fans had not fought for 10 years to get him to come back and basically annoyed Conan Doyle enough to write some more books. Because
shut
I
up
would
already.
say
All right, I'll do it.
70% of what we know of the Sherlock Holmes story, including The Hound of the Baskervilles, was written afterwards. And and the same with Shakespeare. Shakespeare had fallen out of fashion in the 1700s, and I think it was because of people who were big fans of his who really fought to bring him back, as opposed to Ben Jonson or Christopher Marlowe or any of the other writers we have at the time of Shakespeare that really pushed for him. And his folios and all this sort of stuff was the reason that Shakespeare is considered the place he is today. I don't think it. I'm sure there's some Shakespeare historians who are going to be like, what are you talking about? But I do think it is because of the works of people who were fans that certain voices rise to the top. And it's not necessarily because they were the best. I mean, Shakespeare is obviously an incredible writer, but there were other incredible writers. He is not a single entity writing plays in Tudor England. But it's because people wanted to raise his voice up or chose to help be part of that. So it's definitely, fans are important. Be nice to your fans. They're gonna be the reason you get anywhere.
Right.
You know? So
that's such a good point. Yeah. And again, all that stuff was amazing information to me. And I can kind of relate to you and mentioning your dad. So my dad is a huge Sherlock Holmes fan too, and the only reason why I'm really familiar with any of those stories is because of him. And he went through a period of time where he smoked pipes just to be like Sherlock Holmes, and he actually had a pipe that was shaped like Sherlock Holmes. So
amazing.
It was a whole thing. But thankfully, he doesn't smoke pipes anymore, so that's not healthy. But the pipe itself was very cool. It looked exactly like him and had the whole hat and everything. It was pretty cool. Yeah, probably has that somewhere. So what did your sort of research look like with this book? Besides, I know you've consulted a lot of other books that have been written, but you also kind of dove into some people you got to meet and things like that. So what did some of the research look like?
So a lot of it actually came through the form of interviews. I love talking to people, and that I find is the best way to learn anything, is to have a conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
So I started out by contacting people who I thought would be interesting, predominantly academics, mostly because I kind of felt even if this conversation isn't exactly the conversation I want, they will be able to point me in the direction of the next one. And they might be able to point me in the direction of a paper or a book or something like that, because it was important to me that I got the facts right. I said that sometimes I do play with making the story a little bit more fun, but the facts are right. They are. I did do the research. And I've done a huge reading list if people want it, of where I got it, all the information and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I started pretty much there. And then I dived into podcasts and other books and various different pieces of information, contacting other people, all this sort of stuff, as well as contacting people who were fans themselves. So people who were doing community fan work, setting up fan clubs, or running blogs, doing journalism, people who'd made it their career in some way through YouTube or various other means. And some people said yes to talking to me, and some people said no.
Yeah.
And I wish there are some people who I wish we'd been able to make time to talk, but didn't happen, all this kind of stuff. You know how it goes.
Yes.
But I ended up with this wonderful collection of people. I actually also ended up contacting a load of people through things like Tumblr and Instagram and social media, particularly Tumblr. And I know that everyone's going, it's a crazy site. It is, but it's also, if you are doing fandom stuff, it is a place to go and find people who are doing fandom stuff.
Sure.
And I ended up talking to some people who were involved in setting up the Transformative Works organization and like AO3 and that kind of side of things, which was so interesting to talk about that, because I mean, even if you're not into fanfic, I think everyone, if you're in a vague fandom sphere, will kind of know something about AO3, Archive of Our Own, and fan fiction. So that was really cool to talk about that and what that looks like. But yeah, it was a big game of kind of chasing people down, sending emails, having a chat, seeing where that led me, working out a piece of information, spending an awful lot of time on fan lore as well, which is an archive of fan history, essentially. I think is the only way to describe it.
Wow.
And going back and forth trying to find how to contact somebody. There are some pictures from Star Trek scenes in the book that I've credited to usernames because I could not, for the love of me, find these people.
Wow.
I went over and over again, and there are so many pseudonyms and so many usernames, all this kind of stuff. And it was in this is all very early, not even early internet, so like pre-internet stuff that then got archived online.
Yeah.
They're ghosts, you know? Wow. So if anyone would like to come and tell me who they're credited to and claim them, that would be great. And then in the second edition, I can correct it and make sure they're credited.
Sure.
But at the moment,
you tried. Yeah, I mean,
I tried my best.
Tried to give credit where credit's due.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, they are credited to the usernames. But it was just one of those things where like there is so much more information out there than I could ever include in this book. And one of my favorite things has been people in reviews being like, "Oh, I really wanted it to talk about this and it didn't." And I'm there like, I had to draw the line somewhere. Right. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Actually, one of the first interviews I did, which I think I mentioned in the book, is I was talking to an academic of fandom who was specifically a music academic.
Mm-hmm.
And he went, "Where are you drawing the line then?" And I went, "Well, that's the thing. I don't know yet." And he was like, "I think you need to figure out where you're going to do that, because otherwise this isn't going to be a book. This is going to be a library." And I was like, you are correct. Maybe I should do that. So, yeah, I was very thankful for him telling me to like maybe pick my battles.
Yeah.
But it is interesting as well, because obviously some people want one thing out of a fandom book and other people want another thing, and fandom is never everything to all people.
Mm-hmm.
It can't be. So that's been quite interesting to then see, not only having the discussions beforehand, but seeing them afterwards has been a really interesting experience.
Yeah.
Slightly stressful on both cases.
Yes, well, people get very, very territorial about the things that they're into. So I could see where people are very, what they are into is very coveted. So if it's not covered, then they may get a little defensive. But I'm sure you could, probably like an encyclopedia set of, I mean, there's so many aspects.
More, yeah. I mean, my line ended up basically being, if I have some interest in it,
mm-hmm.
or if it grabs me, that's what I'll include.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will fully hold my hands up to a lot of the things that I talk about are fandoms that either I'm into, or they're ones that are sort of the big name fandoms, Star Trek, Star Wars, those kind of things, Lord of the Rings. We already talked about Sherlock Holmes, these kind of juggernauts of fandom.
Yes.
Because I kind of felt they were ones that everybody could kind of relate to. There was going to be something they would get.
Yeah.
But then maybe the smaller ones are ones that either I thought, oh, that's really interesting, like Undertale. I don't know anything about Undertale, but I'm fascinated by it as a concept, as a video game, and the fandom that comes with it is fascinating. And there are some incredible YouTube essays that I definitely didn't spend multiple days watching about it. And the same as, so there are things like that in there. The same is true of things like Heartstopper, which I mentioned. It's not my thing, but the fandom's super interesting. What's going on there is super interesting.
Yeah.
And so it was things where I kind of was like, what's going on here? Why is this happening? What about this is exciting? And I'm going to mention it.
Sure.
And so, of course, I'm sure there are people who would disagree with me and be like, oh, but my fandom's interesting too. Or this thing, you didn't talk about this. And I'd be like, I can't hold all these pies.
I will write that down. I'll write that down and take that into consideration for the next one. Thank you for your feedback. Yeah.
Pretty much.
Well, yeah. And I did not grow up, I admit I did not grow up being a Star Trek fan. However, I found what you wrote about in regard to Star Trek was really fascinating. And that sounds like that was sort of another instance of it kind of was going to come and go and be on TV, and then or was going to be taken off the air. And then it sounded like people again were like, I don't think so. So can you tell us a little bit about what that looked like?
Yeah. So Star Trek, I think, is very much a case of, as I think is the case with pretty much all fandoms that do very well, or I don't even necessarily mean fandoms, pop culture entities that do well. It's a thing of right time, right place, right? Mm-hmm. Star Trek came out in the 60s, my goodness, my brain, 1960s. Wow.
Yeah.
In a moment of technological joy and excitement, and we're moving into the future, and everything's so exciting. Little did they know. And there's this kind of whole really hopeful element to it that I think people really needed. And that coming, you've got the Cold War happening. You've just come out of 2 major world wars. Everyone's kind of still a bit shaken up by this. What does the future look like? We see a lot of science fiction around this time.
Yes, huge at that time. Yes.
And I think what Star Trek did, it was on TV, which made a huge, huge difference. So like it's one of the first TV sci-fis that really takes off and grabs people's imagination. But I think the major difference, and it's one of the huge differences that you see with it as opposed to a lot of other sci-fi of the time, is how diverse it is as a cast and how incredibly forward-thinking they are with what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And you still watch it, and it's a bit hokey because it's 60 years old, but those storylines, those conversations, they still hold up. People still talk about them. People still talk about, there's a reason that Captain Kirk and the whole crew are as beloved as they are.
Yeah.
Star Trek has the first interracial kiss. It has.
I didn't even realize that. That's amazing.
Yeah. It has a Japanese man and a Russian man as major parts of the crew at a period where you're in the Cold War and you've just come out of Japanese concentration camps happening in the US and the bombs being dropped and all this sort of stuff. You have this incredibly open and exciting crew who are wanting to talk about things. Women are represented as equals to the men within the situation. As much as, I do think they build that up more as you go on. Uhura, definitely. You couldn't have Star Trek without Uhura. She's so important. She's not just the secretary standing there taking notes.
Yeah.
She's a member of the crew and she's trusted. And, you get people like Whoopi Goldberg talking about how she was inspired by Uhura. And you're like, yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
But this was one, she was an African-American woman on TV in the 60s and she was respected.
Yeah.
And I think that is so incredibly important for the way, the reason it became what it was and the reason people begged for it to stay on the air was because it was opening up the world in a way that other things weren't. And it was on primetime TV, right? It was on at a time when housewives could get into it and and so the majority of the fan base for Star Trek, the original series, is women. It's a hugely female fan base.
Yeah,
it still
did not think that at all. That is amazing.
We've kind of been brainwashed into this idea now, particularly since Next Generation and Voyager and stuff, that Star Trek is a guy's thing and it's kind of nerdy and all this sort of stuff.
Right.
But when it first came out, it was absolutely not. It was women who loved it and pushed for it and wanted it to be what it was. And a lot of women worked on the show, but lots of women have continued to work on the show. Anybody who says that Star Trek has gone woke, in inverted commas, is a moron. I think it always was. What were you watching?
Right. It's been progressive. Yeah.
Yeah. And I personally think that it hit a cultural zeitgeist in a way that nothing else in the period, apart from Doctor Who. I think Doctor Who is the only other thing, and obviously they're on different sides of the Atlantic, so it's slightly different.
Sure.
But Doctor Who, I would say, did the same in the UK in many ways as Star Trek did in the States. I think Doctor Who was still a little bit behind on some of its progressive politics, and it's still playing catch up a little bit, but it was doing very much the same thing and trying to think about the same ideas and all that kind of stuff. And I think these ideas of science fiction being a hopeful story, but not necessarily pushing that. There were still bad things. They still had to overcome stuff.
Right.
But it was inherently a thing about helping each other. And I have the story in the book. I don't want to give too much away about the book.
Right, yeah.
About Gene Roddenberry's...
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
the plane crash that Gene Roddenberry is in as a young man.
That was another aspect. I was like, holy guacamole, that is unreal. Yeah.
And again, Gene Roddenberry is a writer, and so he absolutely made the narrative fit himself. But it did happen. There are other eyewitnesses to it. Obviously, other people were in the crash. Other people survived. He did do what he said he did.
Yeah.
He definitely makes himself the hero of his own story, which we all do.
Sure.
But it's a good story to tell. It's a great thing to be like this U.S. Air Forceman who's become a commercial pilot, and then there's a crash that could have been avoided, and he's saving people and dragging them out, and then they're in the desert and they're stranded and they have to go off and get help and all band together and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And he takes that, and from that writes Star Trek. You can totally see it.
Yeah.
I hope people go and read the much better version of the story that I wrote in the book. But he was a really fascinating man, and I think he wanted to show that the world could be better, and people wanted to see that at the time. I think people still want to see that.
Sure.
And it's very interesting that Star Trek, I think, really, really just banged the nail on the head for some people, for a lot of people. And they were the reason it stayed on the air. Like, it was only going to get one season, and it wasn't necessarily, it was sort of a trial. And then people loved it so much. And then you get Captain Kirk come along, and the whole thing just glues together perfectly. And it's like, yep, this is a cultural game changer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I'm trying to think how many decades that show was on the air. And then there's been at least one major motion picture. Well, probably no more than one, I think. This is
6
out of my wheelhouse. Yeah.
It's a lot.
But lots of major motion pictures. That's crazy how that could have not happened had people not sort of come forth and said, this needs to stay on. This is our thing. Keep it going. That was a really interesting part of the book that I highly recommend. I mean, the book as a whole is really a fun read and very enlightening and fascinating. But that was a really interesting portion of the book, especially if somebody, again, for me, who isn't I'm familiar with Star Trek, but never really like got into it. But to learn kind of the background behind it is really was an amazing thing to learn about. It was just really, really cool. You did some really great research with it and things that I think people like me, it's really helpful to learn, because now I understand why kind of there's that strong interest in it. Because my sister, who my podcast is inspired by, was started because of huge Lord of the Rings fan, huge Hobbit fan, huge like interest in like sci-fi and fantasy and stuff like that. So I always like learning about people who find that stuff intriguing. I think is really, really cool. So you mentioned that you've been going to like fan conventions and stuff like that since you were a teenager. Do you remember what your first fan convention was?
Yeah, I actually can't, because I was 15, I think. It was 14 or 15. That's the thing I can't quite remember. It's like, was it before my birthday or after my birthday? And there was like an event held at a bookshop in my town. And it was held by like a manga publisher in the UK, where they were obviously trying to get more interest in this thing. And up until that point, I'd kind of been doing nerd stuff sort of in isolation. Not entirely, like, I've been doing it with my friends kind of thing, but I kind of hadn't realized that there was more that I could go to. I was kind of starting to get that idea as a teenager that there's something else. Oh, it's exciting.
Right.
And I went along to this like event in the bookshop, and it kind of blew my mind a little bit, because people had come in cosplay, people had like made their own stuff, there was people doing fan art, all this kind of stuff, things that I'd sort of seen happening online as sort of an abstract. Suddenly it was like, oh, there are people near me who live in the same town as me, or the one over, or whatever, who do this is so cool, and they were all kind of my age, and that was really exciting, because it was obviously aimed at a certain age group. And I ended up chatting with some guys there who, it turned out, we had friends of friends, all this sort of stuff, because, small town, you're going to know each other. And they literally went, 2 weeks, we're going to London Comic Con. Do you want to come? And I went, oh, yeah, no, I totally want to come. And they're like, yeah, we're going to be wearing cosplay. Do you want to come? We could all make something and then we can go. And I was like, yeah.
Sign me up. Yeah.
And somehow my parents just said yes to this. And we're like, yeah, you can totally go to London with these people. I realized after the fact that the Friends of Friends was through, like my parents knew their parents.
Okay.
There was enough connection for them to be like, this is fine. These are reasonable people for you to do this with. And so, that was my first time. And I made a costume in like 2 weeks with some friends, and it was not good. We were still pretty pleased with it ourselves, because we had no idea what we were doing. But So we did that, and then we all went up on to train together. And then I have actual photographs from that day I have no memory of taking, because clearly I was so excited by
awesome.
being near my people that like it just went in a blur. And I only stayed for the day, and my parents actually did come and pick me up afterwards. But it was like just one of those things where you're like, oh, this is what I want to do. I'm going to save all my money and do this every year, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I got so into cosplay. I started learning to sew a few years later and all this sort of stuff. And then, I mean, I now, cosplay is kind of the thing I suppose I'm known for. Like, it's the thing that I get called up by various media agencies and be like, can you talk about cosplay? And I'll be like, yeah, okay.
Let me think about it. Yes. What time?
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely do that. So, that's kind of what I do. I talk a lot about cosplay as a subculture. I think it's one of the few, again, I'm sure there are some academics out there who will argue with me, but I would say it's one of the few true subcultures we have left in the idea of mods and rockers and punks and all this sort of stuff. I would say that actually for the 21st century, cosplay is pretty high up there as one of those kind of subcultural groups.
Yeah.
It's very DIY and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Anyway, that's an entire different conversation.
Yes.
But yeah, so that was the first one I remember going to. And then I literally, that was sort of like it for me. I wanted to go to these events, and I ended up making loads of friends. I would be that really annoying kid who'd go and hang out with the Marvel writers if I could, and all that kind of stuff. And I wanted to be part of it. And maybe I sealed my fate, because now that's all I can do.
Yeah.
It was definitely the big turning point for me, was finding out that there were people who were like me, who wanted to talk about these things, who wanted to be interested in it. Because as much as like I had friends who were into it, it wasn't quite the same. Like, they weren't necessarily the same level as me. They weren't necessarily like, oh, this is the best thing ever, which I was like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And I have some friends who I met at that first convention, or like the one after, who are still in my life. They're still people who I talk to on maybe a weekly basis.
Wow.
If not more than that. People I still hang out with, people whose weddings I've been to, all that kind of thing.
Oh my goodness.
So, it was sort of a bonded for life, kind of through the fire sort of moment for a lot of us. But
yeah,
I found that conventions were a place that I could, this was my people, this was my tribe, as it were. It's a slightly problematic phrase, but like,
yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Yeah, it was where I found it. In fact, it's where I met my partner. Was through the convention circuit, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
But,
well, that's well, what better way? I mean, that's kind of ideal circumstance. That's pretty cool to know that you're on the same page about stuff. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Fun story. We met because we are Star Wars people, and we met because they were dressed as Kylo Ren, and I was dressed as General Hux, of all things, because I was feeling some bad guy vibes. And we were taking some pictures together, and my friend was like, who was taking the picture, literally turned to me and went, okay, cool, how do we feel about doing some choking? And both of us burst out laughing, and then she went, no, I meant like force choking, oh my god. And we were just like, what is happening? We met each other like half an hour ago. And the rest is history.
Nice.
Less choking involved, thankfully.
Yes, that's good. That's good.
But no, it was just one of those moments. It was so funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I just think it's those sort of little moments that you kind of go, oh yeah, that doesn't happen anywhere else.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's how I found a lot of comfort, and I've always been a huge Walt Disney World fanatic. It's a very long-winded, decades-old story, and I think I kind of got into podcasts because I'm like, I wonder if there are other people that maybe are obsessed with Disney World too, and maybe do like a podcast about it. And lo and behold, there's like a million of them. It's like, oh my god, there are other Disney adult nerds out there who want to learn about attractions that have closed or whatever. And it is amazing, just that level of comfort, and just knowing you are, like you said, with your people, when you kind of all are really into the same thing. And it's something that you think about, it's something that you read about, it's something that you write about. It's so comforting to know that you're not alone in the interests that you have. It's whether you're 10 or 50 or whatever, it's really nice knowing that there's other people that you can relate to and are as obsessive about something as you are. It's a pretty
Oh, absolutely.
great feeling. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a really funny story that you met your partner through that. That's funny.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that's cute.
But I have to say I'm fascinated by the Disney park fandom, because I didn't know that was a thing until quite recently.
Yes.
And it's almost something I wish I'd found out about while I was researching this book, because I knew like Disney fans were a thing, obviously, but people who were fans of the parks and how the parks were put together, I was like, that's amazing.
Mhm.
I love that, because A, that's such a out there choice, love that.
Yeah.
But B, I'm fascinated with how some of these rides work, like the animatronics and all this kind of thing. I love watching that. I'm a big fan of bigatures as a general premise. I love it. It's because I'm a Lord of the Rings fan and watched all the DVD extras.
Sure. Yeah.
But I was just like, what a cool thing
Yeah.
to know the history of and want to like talk about. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was a bit like, there is a list of things that I'm like, if I ever get to write a second book or write another book around a similar topic, I want to include, because it's amazing. And I am genuinely like, people will always have their thing. It will be niche, it will be out there, it might be the same thing as everybody else, but it will be their thing.
Right.
And I talk about the swimming pool metaphor, which my co-host on the podcast, Vivian, came up with, which is the best metaphor for anything ever to do with fandom, which is if you go into the swimming pool, everybody there is enjoying the swimming pool, except some people are going to be sitting on the sun loungers around the side, and they're probably not even going to get into the water, but they're still there enjoying the swimming pool. And some people will be dive bombing into the deep end and sitting on the bottom of the pool with nobody else and causing a massive splash.
Yeah.
And they're also enjoying the swimming pool, but in a completely different way. And then there's everything in between.
Yeah.
And everyone's still there enjoying the swimming pool. And that's how I feel about fandom stuff. It doesn't matter where you're at, you're still really enjoying the fandom, and it's your vibe. And sometimes the person making a big splash is annoying because you didn't want to get wet, but you'll dry off and it'll move on and it'll be fine. It doesn't matter. You know, and I love that as a metaphor. I think it's a really good way to talk about this kind of thing.
Yes.
That it's like, you might be that person who's literally just dipping their toe in the edge, and then they might find, oh no, I've been pulled under and now this is my thing.
Right.
Or you might be like, okay, cool, I'm just going to sit on the edge of this for a while and see what other people are doing, and that's nice. Which I think a lot of people have that with a lot of stuff, that they're like, I know a bit about this.
Right.
I know a bit about the Hannibal fandom. It's my partner's big thing. They love the Hannibal books and the TV show.
Yeah.
And so I know a bit about it because of them, but I'm like, Mads Mikkelsen's in it.
Right. Yeah. No, that is a great way to, that is a really good way of looking at it. I think that is a really, really good point and a good observation. Yeah, especially if you're, like you said, your partner or family member or something, you get kind of exposed to something. And so your experience might be a little bit different, but you may have an interest in it just by coincidence, just by proximity, just by, so that is a great way of looking at it. What do you kind of hope that people will take away from your book?
Honestly, I hope that they take away that the world is a very strange place, and that's brilliant. Like everybody, like I said, everyone has their thing. I would like them to take away that these are important to people, and it's not frivolous. It's not silly. It's not just buying another piece of plastic to put on your shelf. I mean, everyone loves buying a piece of plastic to put on their shelf, don't get me wrong.
Sure.
Or merchandise of your choice. I'm sure like there's lots of Disney guys who buy all the ears and things like that, right? And I don't get that. I have one set, which is the Baby Yoda ones that they did for Paris, and I don't think they actually did them anywhere else. Yeah. But I totally get that sort of stuff, but it's not just that. It's so much more than that. It is that thing that, like we talked about at the beginning, it connects you to people in your life, and it may not be that you get everything that one person likes about it, but you form a bond. And I think it's that actually it is entirely human nature to relate to stories, and that is so much part of what we are, and it is part of how we work as a society to disregard fans and fandom as over the top and silly and screaming or nerds in a basement or dressing, all that kind of stuff is counterproductive to what actually they're doing, which is being happy, And fandom also has like all these other deeply massive issues and drama, because humans be doing the human thing, and they like, I definitely make a very frivolous comment about how equating the idea of fandom arguments to the Catholic Church and the divisions within Christianity, which maybe is a bit too.
There's divisions, yes.
Well, exactly. If humans like to argue about canon and about what's accurate and all this kind of stuff, and I would much rather than doing it about Star Wars than about other things, doesn't cause so many issues. Not to say that Star Wars fans haven't caused some serious issues in their time. They will be held accountable. I just find that in the long run, these are... Okay, there's a quote from Terry Pratchett, which is that humanity happens when the falling angel meets the rising ape, and that we need stories to make us human. And we have to believe in things to make us human. And that is what I see fandom as being. And being the continuation of things that humans have done forever, which is tell stories and like them and change them and play with them and discuss them with each other and use them as metaphors and use them as ways of understanding the world. It just so happens we live in an era of increased ridiculous pop culture and massive amounts of content. I hate the word, but same, yes, and art and creation, and we can access it with the touch of our fingers, which we could never do in the past. And so it feels more invasive and over the top, and like, oh my god, everyone's buying so much stuff because there's stuff to buy, and all that kind of thing. And I absolutely think there is a consumerist element to it, but it's definitely not the only element. And it would be I think unfeeling to say that it was. But it is that thing of like, humans really like to find meaning in stuff, and stories help us do that. And that is what we're doing with fan culture. It is that. And it's lovely because it just connects people. And there's I definitely talk about some of the darker stuff in the book as well. So people don't think it's all sunshine and roses at all. There's a whole bit about Gamergate, which was horrific to research. I did not enjoy that. That chapter has a real tonal shift as well, because I was just like, I can't make a joke about this. There is no joke to make here. There is, I cannot be lighthearted about people having their lives ripped apart by trolls on the internet in the way that they were. So I think I make quite a lot of jokes afterwards, but totally lighten the mood again. But it was very much like one of those things where I was like, it's not all great. It's not all perfect. And I don't want people to think that. But I do want people to realize that that doesn't mean it's not important. And it doesn't mean it like I said, it's not just idiots arguing online. It's not just kids playing in their basement. It's not just guys screaming down a headphone on games. Which I think a lot of the media portrays fan culture as. It's finding reasons to make, connect with your sister, but in making a podcast because of the connection you had there. It's me thinking about like knowing this memory of my dad. And
I love that.
My dad passed away 9 years ago, and one of the last things we did together was go and see the Hobbit movies. That was one of the last things we did, was to go to those movies. He kind of didn't really want to go because he didn't know if he was going to live to see the last one. And he did. So we went, know? And it's like, that was something that was super important to me to do, and it may not have been the most important thing to him, but he knew it was important to me. And so like, that is why when I talk about fan culture and I'm so stupidly passionate about it, it's because it gives people these moments and these memories, these connections that can never be taken away from them and will solidify it, as part of who they are as a person. So, wow. So I got really deep and philosophical there.
No, I'm on the same page as you. And I think maybe you can relate to this, as I think part of why I'm so passionate about pop culture and find it so like therapeutic and cathartic too, is for me is it helps me focus on aspects of my sister and growing up with her that aren't associated with like sadness, or aren't associated, not that I think about her passing every moment of every day, as I'm sure you do about your dad, but it helps you to associate memories with him that aren't focused on, on how he was, not feeling well or not doing well or whatever. And his passing is what are something that memories I have that are funny, that are, inspirational, that are, whatever it is, it's kind of making a connection, but it's like, a happy memory too, not just something associated with sadness. So,
and I think humans are very, very good at being able to do that, but we need the thing to focus it on.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is very dark, but so the day that my dad passed away, the night before, we were staying at the hospice that he was at and all this sort of stuff, and I was really struggling to get to sleep for obvious reasons.
Sure.
And so I was in, I was actually, I think I was reading The Lord of the Rings, because I was like, I need to do something comforting. I need to do something that was going to settle me, all this sort of stuff. So I'm sat doing that, and I was just there and like really feeling it.
Mm-hmm.
And the nurse comes into the room I'm sitting in, which is completely dark apart from me and like a torch, because I couldn't find a light switch, and this book. And she screams.
Oh, no.
Because I'm wearing like an animal onesie, like a child. And she was like, I thought it was a giant dog. And like, this is one of the funniest moments of my life that happens in such a moment of grief.
Yes.
And again, it's connected to this thing. I'm sat there reading The Lord of the Rings. I'm trying to comfort myself. I'm finding a moment in these stories.
Right.
And I think it's so wonderful to be able to go, yeah, but like, that was so silly.
Yeah. Right. I terrified a nurse. Yeah. Who's probably seen everything under the sun, and they were scared by. Yeah, that's funny.
Exactly. And I just this is what I mean, is that like, I think we find these points of like, that is the thing that makes this bearable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for a lot of people, fan culture, fandom, being around other fans, being and loving these stories makes things bearable.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever their particular brand of trouble, grief, trauma is,
right. Right. Yeah. Or even or if you're kind of made fun of for something that you like, when you can finally find people that are into it and aren't judgmental and they're as into it as you are, that can be a comfort, because sometimes, you're off on your own island when there's something that you're really into and people are like, don't get it, or think, why are you, wasting your time? I know a lot of, this whole Disney adult thing, people get, made fun of, or if you don't have kids, why are you going to Disney World? You shouldn't be going. That's really weird. Which doesn't make any sense. So it's nice when you can find
let people be happy.
Right. Exactly. Like, as I like to say, and I've said this on my podcast, before too, is like, there's worse things to be addicted to. It's like, I have a whole behind me, which you can't really see, but I've got a whole collection of like old Disney World books. It's like, there's a lot worse things I could have spent money on than that, or, a lot of things that you could be doing with your time that aren't very healthy, but you spend it doing, doing things that you enjoy, that are healthy, that are good outlets, that surround you with good people. That's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think everyone, like we said, everyone has their little quirk.
Sure.
And I am very happy now. It's one of the things I like about social media, is it means that people can find the other people.
Yeah.
Like, there are 100 problems with it. But being able to find people who are like you used to be so much harder. You had to go to a bookshop, an event, and suddenly realize at age, whatever, that, oh my God, I'm not the only weirdo in the city. And that is a wonderful thing to do. But being able to know that some other people, that you can listen to a podcast like this, or you can find them on TikTok or whatever, and start finding community through Discord, and I think the internet in general. I think I talk about the history of the internet in regards to fandom in the book quite a lot, because I think it is an incredibly important thing. I think it was the
absolutely
biggest change to how fan culture is and how it's perceived as not an entirely weird thing that your friend down the road does and you don't quite get, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
It definitely is a huge part of making geek cool.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, geek chic, is that what you called it? I think geek chic.
Yeah. But I think that being able to understand each other is, I'm so glad that we're starting to see that cringe is dead. I mean, some people never always want to kind of be like, oh my God, that's so embarrassing.
Right.
But actually, because you can go, oh no, but it's not just me on my own anymore.
Right.
You don't feel like that.
Yeah.
And I do think that's a very good thing. So yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I so agree with that. It's like, oh, you think I'm a dork? Well, look at these, 500 other people that are like, rocking their, their Ninja Turtles t-shirts or something. It's not. I'm not by myself on this one. Yeah, it's I think that this book is going to provide a lot of just information just in general that's really interesting. I think also, I mean, hopefully provide some comfort to people too. Like, yeah, you know what? Like, I'm into this stuff and it's good. Like, it's a good thing, and it's helped me meet some really cool people. It's helped me not feel not alone. It's helped me learn something about myself. It's provided me a creative outlet.
All of these things.
Yeah.
There is so much more to it than one of the things I loved talking about was particularly fan works, zines, fan fiction, fan art, fan music, all of this kind of stuff. It was cosplay, and how incredibly creative fans are, and how it creates a space not just for an outlet but also for learning new skills, learning to, some people who start out as fan artists now work on some of the major video games and comics and all this sort of stuff because it's where they started and they were able to use that as they might not even be into particularly fan stuff anymore, but it was their beginning because they were given a space to be good at it. I say there are some issues with social media. I think one of the issues actually is that people don't feel like they can be bad at things anymore. They have to be perfect at it because they're only seeing perfect versions. Whereas back in the day, you got a piece of fan art that you wanted to draw and you drew it and it wasn't brilliant, but people would be like, hey, also not going to say that the internet in the past was perfect. Absolutely not. There was always people who were assholes.
Yes.
But there would also be someone there who'd be able to be like, hey, have you tried this technique? Or this is so cool. I'm so glad you drew it. Welcome to the community, and I really hope that people can kind of get over the worry of not being perfect in online spheres soon. Yeah. Because I think it's really good to just create and be a fan and enjoy creating together. Mm-hmm. It's really cool. It's really being rubbish at things is cool, guys. Just enjoy it. Enjoy making, and then you get better by doing it. Like I said, my first costumes were not good. They were not good. And it took me a long time to start making things that actually I would look back on and go, that one was good. Right. But I loved wearing every single one. And I made friends because of every single one I did. And I had a good time. Mm-hmm. And that joy is not diminished by the fact that it wasn't a competition winning perfectly sewn 3D printed piece of art. Right. The
3D printers didn't even exist when
exactly. Oh my God, the things that did not exist.
Right.
Like thinking about how
Go ahead.
Yeah. My thinking about the first few costumes I did that involved like any kind of foam work and like using like the kids craft foam that you have for like school art having to like heat it up with like a hairdryer to it was a whole thing, and now you can just you can get this amazing EVA foam and like you can do anything you want, and you've got patterns and tutorials online that you can just access. Like, oh, they don't even know they're born. No, right. That makes me sound so old.
Yeah. That first convention you went to, did you wear when you were on I think you said you took the train to London to go to the first fan convention, did you wear your costume on the train?
No, I did. Well, so I changed on the second train in like the toilet, which is very funny. But I put like a big hoodie on over the top because I was wearing a costume from a Final Fantasy game, and they're not necessarily conducive to public transport. Like it wasn't like bad, but at the same time, like I was a 14, 15-year-old kid on a train wearing a slightly skimpy outfit. It probably wasn't a vibe. And I was definitely a bit uncomfortable until I got to the con and was like, okay, we're all doing this. This is fine. Yeah. But I don't think I would do, I did it once And then afterwards it was more of a like, cool, I'll take my stuff in a bag and change when we get there, or get a hotel, or friends got a hotel, so I'll just go and change with them, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I didn't normally wear my costume on the train. I've had a few times wearing it home on the train just because I've been so tired.
Yeah.
But that's a slightly different look, wig off, kind of looking, body paint coming out. Yeah, it's a different vibe.
Yeah. Well, half and half. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Understandable.
But yeah, weirdly, I think like actually the London Comic-Con that's coming up, I wasn't sure if I was going to be going for various different reasons. I've really needed to take the last few years I've gone pretty hard with being involved in community organizing, and I really needed a big break.
Sure.
So I wasn't sure if I was going to go, but I'm doing a panel. So if you're coming to London Comic-Con, please come and see my panel. It's on Saturday on the Cosplay Central stage. We're going to teach acting. No, we're going to be talking about performance in cosplay, and skit writing and all that kind of stuff. So it's quite a fun panel.
Nice.
I'll probably fall over. And so I'm now having to be like, I haven't booked a hotel or anything. I'm probably going to have to just go on the train in my costume like I did 20 years ago. Oh, no.
Well, I bet you, hopefully at this point, I mean, it's gotten so extensive and hopefully generated so much interest. I bet hopefully there'd be like multiple people on the train that.
I think so. There definitely is. You can normally tell when you're getting close to the venue because the stations start to have more and more cosplayers standing on them. So no, it's definitely not so much of a weird thing now, but it does feel a little bit odd.
Yeah.
Walking to the train station. I say that I'm probably going to be going in like I do a lot of historical and vintage fashion. As you can see, I'm wearing my little metal cricket jumper right now. I do sort of 1920s through to 1950s.
Cool.
Sometimes a bit earlier.
Yeah.
So it's slightly less weird now because I dress like that all the time. So like people in my town kind of know.
Right.
Is that weirdo who dresses like Bertie Wooster walking past? There they go.
Yeah.
But we'll see. I don't even know what I'm going to cosplay yet. I haven't even decided. That's how much I was not prepared for this to be a thing.
Yeah, comes out quick.
Yeah, it really did.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'll be nice to kind of have to be going to an event in a sort of old school kind of way. Actually, it's going to be good fun.
Yeah,
I'm looking forward to not having to be vaguely important.
Yeah. Well, it's nice that you continued. It still continues to be something that you enjoy doing, and you can kind of speak from experience, and you're kind of a known entity. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is cool. It's slightly scary when people come up to you in places you're not expecting, go, "Are you such and such?" You go, "Oh God, yes."
Why do you
hello.
I could be.
It could be. I'm not wearing the cosplay right now, so maybe I'm not. But
right.
Yes.
If I was to say yes, what would be your response?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's quite. I feel like I'm a micro celebrity in a minor part of the internet, like less than said list, but it is kind of weird.
Yeah. Nice. Well, that's when you know you've made it. If your dad could see you now,
he'd be like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah. Like, who knew when I was reading you, The Hobbit in your room that it would evolve into this? That's pretty cool. Yeah.
Oh God.
Yeah. So, well, I guess so. My last question and in conclusion, I'll let you go about your day here. And thank you so much for your time. Is where can people find you out in the world, and where can they find your book and your previous writings?
So they can find me on Instagram. I have the most irritating username. I'm Lilist Prince, which is LILIST Prince, all one word, and I will give you the link so that people can find it. And that is the same on my TikTok. I'm not super active on social media. I kind of post when and wherever I'm interested to.
Yeah.
That's my main social media. I'm also, as I said, I'm on Tumblr under the same username.
Okay.
So you can find me there as well. Again, it's not super active. It's mostly me reblogging pictures of Sherlock Holmes at the moment. In fact, almost entirely, that's kind of all I'm doing on there. It's great fun. And Pathologic, because I like video games that make me cry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm kind of, I vaguely exist online. My website, which is being rebooted at the moment, is hollyswinyard.co.uk. It's nice and easy to find. It's my name, and then that. And that should be back up and running in a couple of weeks, but at the moment it's non-existent. So,
sure.
and they can find my book linked in pretty much all those places.
Okay.
And you can find my podcast as well, which is I'm a Fan of That podcast. Again, it's on all of those places, as well as having its own social media. So if you search us, you'll find us.
Okay.
And you can get my book on Amazon, pretty much any good bookshop, any bad bookshop, just a bookshop. You can get the book. And it's currently on pre-order. You can also get it directly from my publisher, which is Pen and Sword. And the book is called A History of Fans and Fandom, The Passion and Power of Fan Culture. I will send you a load of links to put in the show notes so that everyone.
I was going to say, I'll make sure to add all that stuff. And I think on Amazon, at least in the United States, it says that it's being released I think at the end of June. But I know sometimes Amazon, I feel like people have told me it's not always correct with dates.
So technically in the UK, it has, if you go directly from the publisher, you will, it's technically out, but it's not in bookshops yet. It's publishing things. It's a bit weird.
Sure.
So yes, I go to a local bookshop.
Yeah.
I know that Amazon's obviously the easiest thing for everybody, but please go to a local bookshop, support local businesses.
Agreed.
But yes, A History of Fans and Fandom, The Passion and Power of Fan Culture. It's out, it's there, it's in the world, and you can get it. And please tell me if you like it.
Yes.
Maybe don't tell me if you don't. That'll make me cry. But
no, it's a great.
All reviews are good.
I think it's a great read. I think anybody who listens to this show would enjoy the book, and clearly a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into it. So I definitely recommend it. So, well, Holly, thank you so much for your time today and for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And when this episode gets released, I'll make sure to put links to everything in the show notes. And it was a pleasure. And I wish you all the luck with the release of this spectacular book.
Thank you so much.
I hope you've enjoyed this detailed look at Fans and Fandom with the one and only Holly Swinyard. They were so much fun to chat with, and as you can tell, they are a wealth of information and knowledge on this topic they are so clearly passionate about. I learned so much from our conversation and from their book. I will make sure to link information about their book, website, etc. in the show notes. I hope you will join me for my next show where we will take a look back at another fascinating facet of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Until then, be kind, be safe, and hold on to your memories.
Thank you for tuning into my mama's podcast and the memories of Auntie Rebecca.